What if I told you that there once lived an emperor so consumed by paranoia that he outlawed sleep itself? What if I told you that his subjects, driven to the brink of madness by endless wakefulness, began to see things that weren't there, hear voices from the shadows, and eventually turned on each other in the most horrific ways imaginable? This isn't a fairy tale or a work of fiction. This is the true story of Emperor Valerius the Wakeful, and how his decree plunged an entire kingdom into a nightmare that lasted exactly 97 days. The year was 1428, and the Byzantine province of Somnolia was a prosperous land nestled between the Black Sea and the Carpathian Mountains. Emperor Valerius had ruled for 12 years, and by all accounts, he had been a just and capable leader. But something changed in the winter of that year. Something that would transform him from a beloved ruler into the architect of one of history's most bizarre and terrifying social experiments. It began with dreams. Valerius started experiencing vivid nightmares where he saw himself being assassinated by his own guards, poisoned by his advisors, and betrayed by his family. Night after night, these visions grew more intense and more detailed. He would wake screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced that the dreams were prophetic warnings sent by God himself. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Valerius didn't just suffer from these nightmares in silence. He became obsessed with the idea that sleep was when the soul was most vulnerable to demonic influence and treacherous thoughts. He consulted with court physicians, theologians, and even brought in mystics from distant lands. Most tried to reason with him, but there was one advisor who fed into his paranoia. Brother Morpheus, a monk who claimed to have studied the ancient texts of dream interpretation, told the emperor something that would seal the fate of thousands. He claimed that sleep was indeed the gateway through which evil spirits entered the human mind to plant seeds of rebellion and betrayal. According to Morpheus, the only way to ensure absolute loyalty and purity of thought was to eliminate sleep entirely. On December 15, 1428, Emperor Valerius issued the most bizarre decree in recorded history. The Edict of Eternal Vigilance declared that sleep was now considered an act of treason against the crown. Anyone caught sleeping would be publicly executed. Guards were stationed throughout the kingdom with orders to patrol homes, check on citizens, and ensure that not a single person closed their eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. But Valerius went even further. He established what he called the Ministry of Wakefulness, a special division tasked with developing methods to keep the population alert. They used everything from loud bells that rang every few minutes to specially trained roosters that crowed continuously throughout the night. They even developed a primitive form of caffeine extract from imported coffee beans, which was distributed to citizens in mandatory daily doses. The first week was almost manageable. People adapted, taking much when they could, drinking the bitter stimulant concoctions, and supporting each other through the exhaustion. Some even saw it as a temporary madness that would surely pass. But by the second week, the true horror began to unfold. Sleep deprivation, as modern science now knows, doesn't just make you tired. After 72 hours without sleep, the human brain begins to malfunction in terrifying ways. Hallucinations start as fleeting shadows in peripheral vision, but they quickly become vivid, terrifying apparitions that seem completely real. People began reporting conversations with deceased relatives, sightings of monsters in broad daylight, and the sensation that their own reflections were moving independently. By the third week, the kingdom had descended into chaos. Citizens were stumbling through the streets like zombies, their eyes bloodshot and vacant. Productivity ground to a halt as farmers forgot how to tend their crops. Blacksmiths injured themselves with their own tools, and merchants sold their goods for impossible prices because they could no longer perform basic mathematics. But the psychological effects were even worse than the physical ones. Paranoia spread like wildfire through the sleep-deprived population. Neighbors began accusing each other of sleeping in secret, leading to brutal vigilante justice. Families turned against each other, with children reporting their own parents to the authorities for the crime of closing their eyes too long. The emperor himself was not immune to these effects. By the fourth week, Valerius was seeing enemies everywhere. He executed his most trusted advisors, convinced they were plotting against him in their waking thoughts, since they could no longer plot in their dreams. He began holding court sessions that lasted for days, rambling incoherently about divine visions and the purity of the wakeful mind. The turning point came on day 53 of the edict. A baker named Johannes, driven mad by weeks without rest, claimed he had received a revelation from God. He gathered a crowd in the town square and declared that the only way to end their suffering was to kill the emperor and burn down the palace. What happened next would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The sleep-deprived mob that formed around Johannes was unlike anything recorded in history. These weren't rational people making a political statement. These were humans, reduced to their most primal state, operating on pure instinct and hallucination-fueled rage. They moved through the streets like a swarm of insects, picking up anyone they encountered and forcing them to join their march toward the imperial palace. When they reached the palace gates, something extraordinary happened. The guards, who had been awake for the same 53 days as everyone else, simply laid down their weapons. Some historians believe they were too exhausted to fight. Others suggest that they too were experiencing hallucinations that made them unable to distinguish between friend and foe. The mob poured into the palace. But what they found there was even more horrifying than what they had come to do. Emperor Valerius was discovered in his throne room, surrounded by the corpses of his remaining advisors. He had killed them all with his own hands, convinced that they were demons sent to steal his wakeful soul. The emperor himself was alive, but completely mad, talking to invisible spirits and laughing maniacally at jokes only he could hear. But here's where the story takes its most disturbing turn. Instead of killing Valerius immediately, the mob decided to subject him to a twisted form of justice. They tied him to his throne and forced him to watch as they systematically destroyed everything in the palace. They burned his books, smashed his treasures, and defiled the royal tombs. But they kept him alive, ensuring he remained awake to witness every moment of destruction. For 7 more days, they tortured the mad emperor with forced wakefulness, the very punishment he had inflicted upon them. They used his own methods against him, ringing bells in his ears, forcing him to drink the bitter stimulants, and preventing him from closing his eyes even for a second. By the end, Valerius was no longer recognizably human. Witnesses described him as a gibbering wreck, who spoke in tongues and claimed to see angels and demons battling around his throne. On day 60 of the edict, something even stranger occurred. The mob, perhaps finally recognizing the horror of what they were doing, began to turn on each other. Groups formed and dissolved, alliances shifted by the hour, and violence erupted with no clear purpose or target. The sleep-deprived citizens were now fighting wars that existed only in their collective hallucinations. The end came on day 97, not through any human intervention, but through simple biological collapse. The human body, it turns out, has absolute limits. People began dying en masse, their hearts simply giving out from the strain of extended wakefulness. Others fell into comas so deep that no amount of stimulation could wake them. The survivors described these final days as apocalyptic, with corpses lining the streets and the few remaining citizens wandering aimlessly like ghosts. Emperor Valerius died on day 94, still tied to his throne, his eyes wide open and staring at visions only he could see. His last words, according to the few witnesses who retained enough sanity to remember, were a whispered apology to the god he believed had commanded him to ban sleep. When rescue finally arrived in the form of neighboring kingdoms who had grown concerned about the silence from Somnolia, they found a land transformed into a living nightmare. Of the original population of nearly 30,000 souls, fewer than 3,000 had survived. Most of these survivors suffered from permanent psychological damage and would spend the rest of their lives in various states of madness. The few coherent accounts that emerged from the survivors painted a picture of hell on earth. They described a kingdom where reality had become completely subjective, where up was down and day was night, where the living spoke to the dead and the dead seemed to respond. They told of children who aged decades in those 97 days, of adults who reverted to childlike states, and of an entire civilization that had forgotten how to be human. But perhaps the most chilling detail to emerge from the testimonies was this: in the final weeks, many of the survivors claimed that sleep itself had become impossible. Even when the edict was no longer being enforced, even when they desperately wanted to rest. Their minds had been so traumatized by the experience that they physically could not fall asleep. They had been permanently transformed into creatures of eternal wakefulness, living ghosts trapped forever in the nightmare their emperor had created. The ruins of Somnolia were eventually resettled, but the new inhabitants reported strange phenomena for generations afterward. Visitors claimed to hear the sound of bells ringing at all hours, to see shadowy figures wandering the streets at night, and to experience vivid nightmares whenever they tried to sleep within the kingdom's former borders. Some historians suggest these were merely psychological effects, the power of suggestion working on minds that knew the area's dark history. But others believe something more sinister was at work. They argue that Emperor Valerius had succeeded in his twisted goal, that he had indeed created a place where sleep was impossible, where the boundary between waking and dreaming had been permanently shattered. According to these accounts, the kingdom of Somnolia had become a wound in reality itself, a place where the natural order had been so violently disrupted that it could never fully heal. Modern sleep researchers who have studied the historical accounts of Somnolia describe it as the most extreme case of mass sleep deprivation ever recorded. They point out that many of the symptoms described by survivors align perfectly with what we now know about the effects of chronic sleeplessness on the human brain and body. The hallucinations, the paranoia, the physical deterioration, and the eventual system collapse all follow predictable patterns. Yet even these scientific explanations cannot fully account for some of the more disturbing elements of the story. How did an entire population manage to stay awake for 97 consecutive days when most humans begin to experience microsleep episodes after just a few days without rest? How did so many people die simultaneously on that final day? And why did the survivors continue to suffer from insomnia for years afterward, even when they desperately wanted to sleep? Today, the site of ancient Somnolia is a quiet valley in Romania, known locally as Valea Veg, or the Valley of the Wake. Few people live there permanently, and those who do report unusually high rates of insomnia and sleep disorders. Whether this is due to environmental factors, genetic predisposition among the descendants of survivors, or something more supernatural, remains a matter of debate among researchers. What cannot be debated is the lesson that Emperor Valerius and his kingdom learned at such a terrible cost. Sleep is not the enemy of consciousness or loyalty or divine grace. It is one of the most fundamental requirements of human existence, as necessary as food, water, or air. To deny it is to deny our very humanity. The story of Somnolia serves as a dark reminder of what happens when power becomes divorced from wisdom, when fear overcomes reason, and when the natural order is violently disrupted in service of impossible ideals. Emperor Valerius sought to create a kingdom of perfect vigilance, free from the supposed corruption of dreams and rest. Instead, he created a living hell that consumed everything he claimed to protect. In the end, the emperor who banned sleep discovered that some human needs are so fundamental that to deny them is to invite madness, chaos, and ultimately, death itself. His kingdom of eternal wakefulness lasted exactly 97 days before collapsing under the weight of its own impossible demands. But the echoes of that collapse, the whispers of those who never slept again, continue to haunt us centuries later, reminding us that even emperors must eventually close their eyes and dream.